Right now, there is a quiet but genuinely significant shift happening underneath the surface of general aviation that most people flying today haven't fully processed yet. It's not showing up on the front page of any aviation magazine. It's not the lead story at any airshow press conference. But if you pay close attention to where new pilots are training, where certificated pilots are spending their money, and where the regulatory energy in this industry has been pointed for the last several years, you can see it clearly. The sport pilot world, long treated as a kind of entry-level sideshow to the real business of general aviation, is on the verge of something much bigger than anyone in the traditional four-seat market has been willing to fully admit in public. The FAA's Mosaic rulemaking isn't just a tweak, it isn't an incremental update to a niche category. What it actually represents, when you follow the logic all the way through, is a fundamental restructuring of who needs a full private pilot certificate, who needs a third-class medical, and most importantly for our purposes today, who needs a traditional four-seat certified aircraft to accomplish their flying goals. And when you start pulling that thread, what you find underneath is a story about new buyer psychology, about price sensitivity, about lifestyle flying versus mission flying, and about a manufacturing and retail ecosystem for traditional general aviation airplanes that is sitting directly in the path of a shift it didn't plan for and hasn't fully priced in yet. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of forward-looking analysis the industry press tends to soft-pedal when it might make advertisers uncomfortable. And if you want to understand where the demand for new and used general aviation aircraft is actually heading, instead of where the press releases say it's heading, this is the place to be. Let's start by making sure we're on the same page about what sport pilot reform actually is, because a lot of people have only heard the headline number, the weight increase, and they've mentally filed it under light sport stuff doesn't affect me, and moved on. That's a significant mistake if you're thinking about this market seriously, so let's actually walk through what changed and why it matters in a way that's bigger than the weight limit itself. The original sport pilot rule, introduced in 2004, was genuinely revolutionary for its time. For the first time, the FAA created a pathway to a pilot certificate that didn't require a third-class medical, that allowed a simplified training curriculum, and that let people fly a meaningful category of aircraft without all the overhead of the traditional private pilot route. The trade-off was a set of restrictions that were in some ways genuinely limiting. You were capped at 1,320 pounds maximum gross weight for a two-seat land airplane. You could only fly during the day, under visual flight rules, within certain airspeed limits. The aircraft had to meet a specific light sport aircraft standard, and you were basically limited to 2 seats and a level of airplane capability that put a clear ceiling on what the certificate could do for you practically. That ceiling was real, and it shaped buyer behavior in a very specific way. A pilot who wanted to fly his family anywhere, spouse, 2 kids, even just spouse and 1 child with any meaningful luggage, couldn't do it with sport pilot privileges. A pilot who wanted to fly into a busy Class C airport in real weather conditions was pushing up against the VFR-only restriction. A pilot who wanted to build toward instrument flying, toward real transportation utility, toward the kind of mission that justifies a significant financial investment in an airplane, was going to have to get a full private certificate, get a medical, and buy something in the traditional certified 4-seat category to do any of it. Sport pilot was a starting point, a pathway for people who wanted to fly recreationally and didn't need more capability than that, but it had a fairly clear horizon beyond which you simply had to step up. What Mosaic does is move that horizon dramatically. The weight ceiling going up to approximately 3,000 pounds for land-based aircraft, more than double the original limit, is the number that gets cited most often, and it is genuinely significant, but it's only part of what changes. The expanded aircraft eligibility, the updated performance parameters, the modernized approach to the sport pilot category as a whole. What all of it adds up to, when you look at the full picture rather than just the weight number, is a certificate and a category that can now serve a meaningfully broader slice of the flying population's actual goals. Not everyone's goals. Not instrument flying, not commercial operations, not the pilot who genuinely needs to file IFR and punch through a solid overcast to make a business meeting. But a very large share of the discretionary, lifestyle-oriented, personal use flying that actually drives general aviation participation at the grassroots level. That flying, a lot of it, now has a legal pathway under sport pilot rules that simply didn't exist before. And that matters enormously for traditional 4-seat aircraft demand, for reasons that become obvious the moment you sit with the buyer psychology for a minute. Think about who the customer is for a new four-seat general aviation aircraft. Not the corporate operator, not the charter company, not the flight school buying a fleet. Think about the individual buyer, the person who walks into a dealer, looks at a Cessna 172, or a Piper Archer, or a Cirrus SR-22, or any other traditionally certified four-seat single, and considers writing a check. Who is that person really? A significant portion of that buyer pool is made up of people who are primarily recreational and lifestyle flyers. They want to fly on weekends. They want to take short cross-country trips to places that are accessible by other means but more enjoyable by air. They want the experience of flight, the freedom of it, the identity that comes with being a pilot who owns an airplane. They are not primarily buying capability in the mission-critical sense. They're buying access to a flying life that matters to them personally, and they've historically needed to buy into the full traditional GA system, private certificate, medical, four-seat certified aircraft to do it, simply because there was no other legal structure that gave them what they needed. That buyer, or a meaningful fraction of that buyer pool, now has an alternative. Not a perfect substitute for everyone, and we'll talk about where the limitations still matter, but a real, legally viable alternative that gets them into the air, lets them fly the kind of trips they actually take, and does it at a cost structure that is dramatically different from what traditional GA has been charging for the privilege. Here's where the numbers start to sting for the traditional market. A fully equipped new four-seat single in the current market, and we're talking about an airplane that's been certified, built to FAA Part 23 standards, carrying a full manufacturer warranty, is a very expensive thing. Depending on the model and options you're talking about, you're looking at anywhere from the mid-400s to well past $500,000 for a basic four-seat piston single once you've added the glass panel, the autopilot, the leather, the air conditioning, all the things that make a buyer actually want to live with it for a decade. The Cirrus SR-22 in a well-equipped configuration has been brushing up against $550,000, $600,000 and beyond. The Piper Archer is well into the 400s with any meaningful equipment. A new Cessna 172 in a well-equipped training configuration that a private buyer might want is nudging toward $500,000, a number that still genuinely stops people in their tracks when they hear it for the first time. Those prices are not the product of manufacturer greed or laziness. They're the product of real cost structures that have genuinely changed, certification costs that have escalated significantly over the last decade, product liability insurance baked into every unit, materials and labor costs that moved faster than anyone projected, and a regulatory environment where getting a change through the FAA takes longer and costs more than it did in the era when most of these airframe designs were originally developed. The price is what the price has to be to keep the production line running, and the manufacturers building these airplanes are not getting rich off any individual sale. But the price is still the price, and buyers still have to decide whether it's worth it compared to whatever else they can do with that money. Now set that number next to what a buyer can access under expanded sport pilot rules after Mosaic matures. We're talking about aircraft that, at the well-equipped end of the modern light sport market, come in at somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000. At the lower end, you can find genuinely capable, well-built, modern avionics aircraft in the $100,000 to $150,000 range that will get a sport pilot certificate holder off the ground and flying real trips. And at the used end of what will become eligible under the new weight limits, a buyer with a sport pilot certificate might be looking at perfectly airworthy, well-maintained certified aircraft, the kind of stuff that used to be accessible only to private pilots with medicals, now available to them legally, at prices that start well below six figures. That gap, the gap between what you have to spend to get into traditional four-seat certified GA and what you'd have to spend to get into the expanded sport pilot world, is the single most important number in this whole conversation, and the traditional market hasn't figured out how to compete with it in any honest, head-on way. Let's be precise about what we mean by pulling buyers away, because this is not a story about sport pilot aircraft being better airplanes than traditional four-seat singles. They're not, across most of the dimensions that matter for serious mission flying. What this is a story about is a specific buyer profile, the discretionary, recreational, lifestyle-oriented new entrant or returning pilot, deciding, in growing numbers, that the traditional four-seat path isn't the right value proposition for the flying they actually intend to do. Think about the new buyer entering aviation today. They're coming in from a world where they've watched years of drone footage, FPV content, simulator gaming, and general aviation YouTube, and they've gotten excited about actually flying. They've researched their options. They know the private pilot certificate takes real time and real money, somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 on the low end, at a school that's efficiently run, and often significantly more in practice. They know the medical adds another layer of uncertainty, not just the cost, but the anxiety around whether a condition in their medical history is going to create a problem, whether the AME is going to ask follow-up questions, whether they're going to spend months in the FAA's medical certification bureaucracy before they ever get off the ground. And then they know the airplane at the end of that path is going to cost them several $100,000 to buy new, with ongoing costs for hangar, insurance, maintenance, and avionics updates that can easily run $20,000 to $30,000 a year or more depending on the aircraft and the usage pattern. Now show that same person the sport pilot path under Mosaic. No third-class medical required. Use a valid driver's license. A training requirement that, while not trivial, is designed to be more accessible and less bureaucratically complex than the private certificate route. Aircraft eligible under the new rules that are genuinely capable, genuinely modern, and genuinely fun to fly, at a price point that doesn't require taking out a second mortgage or liquidating a brokerage account. For the person who wants to fly recreationally, who wants to go to the fly-in, who wants to make the weekend hop to the beach town 50 miles away, who wants to do the kind of flying that most private pilots actually do with their airplanes most of the time, the sport pilot path under Mosaic is going to look increasingly compelling relative to the traditional route, and that is a real structural change to the buyer pipeline that feeds new general aviation aircraft sales. The traditional four-seat market has always depended on a certain flow of new entrants, who come up through the system, get their private certificate, discover they want more capability or more seats or more useful load than a two-seat basic trainer gives them, and step up into a four-seat certified airplane as their first real ownership purchase. That flow, that pipeline of upgrading pilots, has been one of the structural underpinnings of the market for decades. Not the only buyer, obviously, but a meaningful one. What sport pilot reform does, in the most direct economic terms possible, is create an off-ramp from that pipeline. It creates a legitimate, legal, genuinely capable exit point that lets a pilot say, what I want to do, I can do right here, for a fraction of the cost, without continuing down the path toward a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 purchase. The share of new pilots who take that exit is going to vary enormously based on their goals, their resources, and their ambitions. But it is not going to be zero, and it's not going to be small, and the traditional market doesn't have a clean answer for it. Now let's talk about the specific buyer profiles where this pull is going to be strongest, because this is where it gets very specific and very relevant for anyone thinking about what the next 5 to 10 years looks like for new aircraft sales in this category. The first group is the medically uncertain buyer. This is probably the most immediately impactful pull, because the medical has always been a hidden filter on who even bothers to start down the aviation path in the first place. A meaningful share of the population of people who are interested in flying, who could afford it, who have the time and motivation for it, quietly decide not to pursue it because they have a health history that makes them uncertain about whether they'll be able to get and keep a third-class medical. This isn't just people with obvious disqualifying conditions. It's people managing controlled hypertension, people who've had a history of mild depression or anxiety and were treated for it, people who've had cardiovascular interventions that resolved cleanly but left a paper trail that they're not sure how the FAA reads, people who are just uncomfortable with the idea of their flying privileges depending on a medical bureaucracy that can be opaque and slow and sometimes genuinely arbitrary in its outcomes. That buyer, the medically uncertain buyer who's genuinely motivated to fly and has the resources to do it, has historically been forced to either navigate the medical system and hope for the best, or walk away from aviation entirely. Sport pilot reform, especially as Mosaic expands the category of aircraft and operations available under driver's license medical, gives that buyer a real permanent path into flying that doesn't hinge on the FAA medical office. That's not a niche group. That's a large, underserved, genuinely motivated buyer demographic that has been quietly left out of general aviation's addressable market for decades, and a meaningful share of them are going to show up in the sport pilot channel as it expands, rather than in the traditional four-seat market. And every one of them who does is one less potential buyer for a new certified piston single. The second group is the value-conscious new entrant. This is the person who's looked carefully at the total cost of ownership for a traditional four-seat certified airplane, not just the sticker, but the annual, the avionics updates, the engine reserve, the insurance, the hangar, and done the math honestly. That total cost of ownership math has gotten harder to ignore as prices have moved to where they are now, and the Sport Pilot alternative is going to look increasingly attractive to anyone who's genuinely willing to ask the question, do I actually need everything the traditional airplane gives me, or am I paying for capability I'm never going to use? It's worth sitting with that question seriously for a minute, because the honest answer for a lot of general aviation buyers is that they don't use a significant fraction of what they pay for. A private pilot who owns a four-seat airplane and flies it primarily for weekend recreational trips, who isn't instrument rated, who isn't flying regularly into complex airspace, who is carrying one or sometimes two passengers on typical missions, is paying a significant premium for certified status, for the extra seats, for the useful load margin, and for the resale market depth that comes with flying a common traditional type. And a meaningful share of that premium, if we're being honest, is just inertia. It's what pilots have always done. It's what the industry assumes everyone will do. Under Mosaic, there's a real question about how many of those buyers look at an equivalent sport pilot-eligible aircraft, modern, well-built, capable of the same missions they actually fly, and decide the premium for the traditional path simply isn't justified by how they actually use an airplane. The third group, and this one is genuinely interesting from a market structure perspective, is the returning pilot. Aviation has a significant population of lapsed certificate holders, people who got their private certificates at some point in their lives, flew for a while, let it go as careers and families got demanding, and are now at a stage of life where they want to come back. This demographic is often financially well-positioned to buy an airplane. They have real flying background, so the training burden of returning isn't zero but isn't overwhelming. And they are, in many cases, exactly the age cohort where medical concerns become relevant in a way they weren't when they first got their certificates 30 years ago. For that returning pilot, the traditional path back means dealing with a medical that might be more complicated now than it was in their 20s or 30s. Refresher training to bring their currency back up to private pilot standards, and then navigating a new aircraft purchase in a market that has moved dramatically in price since the last time they were actively shopping. The Sport Pilot alternative under Mosaic offers them a way back in that sidesteps the medical concern, requires a simpler currency pathway, and puts them in an airplane that is, at the right price point, dramatically more accessible financially than the traditional route. Some of them will find that the expanded Sport Pilot world gets them what they actually want from their return to flying. Some won't. Their goals will be more ambitious. They'll want instrument flying, they'll want more useful load for family trips, and they'll need to go the traditional route. But some meaningful fraction will find the exit ramp attractive, and that fraction is, again, real demand that doesn't end up being counted as a new four-seat certified aircraft sale. Let's talk about the lifestyle and recreational flying market specifically, because I think this is the epicenter of the Sport Pilot reform impact, and it deserves careful treatment. When you look honestly at how most private pilots actually use their airplanes, not how they plan to use them when they're making the purchase decision, not the optimistic scenario they tell themselves to justify the expense, but how they actually empirically use them over the lifetime of ownership, the picture is quite specific. The average private pilot in the United States flies somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 hours a year. The missions are overwhelmingly VFR day flights, predominantly within a few hundred miles of home base. The useful load is rarely maximized. Most flights are one or two occupants with light baggage. And the flying is primarily driven by personal enjoyment, the love of the experience itself, rather than by transportation necessity that couldn't be served by driving or flying commercial. For that flying, 50 to 100 hours a year, VFR day, two occupants, recreational and lifestyle purposes. A well-equipped Sport Pilot aircraft under Mosaic is not a compromise. It's an honest answer to what the mission actually is. It may not be a compromise at all, because a modern light sport aircraft with a quality glass panel, a reliable engine, and good short-field performance is a genuinely excellent vehicle for that kind of flying. It's not a Cirrus, it doesn't have the useful load of a 172, but for the mission description I just gave you, it does the job, often very well. And it does the job for a small fraction of what the traditional path costs to enter and sustain. The traditional four-seat market has operated for decades on the implicit assumption that buyers with private pilot certificates would naturally graduate into four-seat ownership because that's the next step, the natural progression, the thing that the system is designed to deliver them to. Mosaic challenges that assumption at the foundational level by creating a legitimate alternative end state, sport pilot certificate, appropriate aircraft, flying life that satisfies the actual goals, that doesn't require completing that progression. And for a buyer who genuinely examines their motivations and their actual intended flying, not the aspirational version of it, but the real version, that alternative is going to look compelling in a way it simply couldn't under the original 2004 Sport Pilot rule. There's a parallel story here about what Mosaic does to the used aircraft market, and it's worth addressing because it connects directly to the competitive pressure on new four-seat sales. The expanded weight ceiling under Mosaic means that a whole tier of used certified aircraft, airplanes that have historically been accessible only to private pilots with third-class medicals, will become available to sport pilot certificate holders. We're talking about older Cessna 150s and 152s that already qualified, but now potentially expanding to include a broader range of aircraft that fall within the new weight and performance parameters. If a sport pilot can legally fly a particular used certified aircraft that previously required a private certificate and medical, the demand for those aircraft from the sport pilot pool adds buying competition for those airplanes, which pushes used prices in that segment up modestly. That's actually not great news for traditional private pilot buyers who are shopping used in the same price range. They now have competition from a broader buyer pool, which makes their preferred used options a little harder to find and a little more expensive. But more importantly for our purposes, it means the sport pilot buyer now has access to a wider range of used aircraft that are genuinely competitive with new four-seat aircraft in certain mission profiles, which gives the sport pilot alternative even more depth as an option set. The more depth and variety the sport pilot world has, including used certified aircraft that fall within Mosaic's expanded eligibility, the more compelling it looks relative to the new traditional four-seat market. Now I want to address the counter-arguments, because this isn't a one-sided story, and intellectual honesty matters here. There are real, meaningful things that sport pilot reform doesn't change, and they matter for understanding which segments of the traditional four-seat market are most exposed to the pull versus which segments are relatively insulated from it. Instrument flying is the big one. Sport pilot certificates, under Mosaic or any version of the rule, do not confer instrument flying privileges. If you want to file IFR, fly in the clouds, operate in IMC, and use aviation for real all-weather transportation capability, you need a private pilot certificate at minimum, almost certainly an instrument rating on top of that, and an aircraft that's equipped and certified for IFR operations. That is a real, meaningful capability gap that no version of sport pilot reform closes, and the buyers who genuinely need that capability, who are using their airplane for transportation in weather that doesn't care about their VFR currency, are going to stay in the traditional market because there's no alternative. Useful load and passenger capacity is the second one. If you are routinely flying 4 people with full fuel and realistic baggage, or if you're carrying meaningful cargo weight as part of your mission, the sport pilot aircraft in the Mosaic world is not going to serve you. The physics of maximum gross weight and useful load don't disappear just because the regulatory ceiling moved. An aircraft certificated and built for 2 occupants and light personal baggage missions is what it is, and a family of 4+ gear needs more airplane than that. The traditional 4-seat market owns that mission, and Mosaic doesn't change it. Speed and range matter too for some buyers. A pilot who regularly makes long cross-country flights where time genuinely matters, where the alternative is a commercial flight that would get them there in a fraction of the block time, needs a fast, efficient cruiser with the range to do meaningful legs between fuel stops. Many sport pilot aircraft, while genuinely capable for their intended missions, are not optimized for long-distance, high-speed cross-country flying in the way that a Cirrus SR-22 or a Beechcraft Bonanza is. That speed and range buyer needs what the traditional market provides and doesn't have a real alternative in the sport pilot world even after Mosaic. So the honest version of the sport pilot reform story for traditional 4-seat demand is this. The buyers who are genuinely pulled away are the recreational and lifestyle buyers who were always, if we're honest, buying more airplane than they needed because it was the only legal option available to them. The buyers who genuinely use the full capability of a traditional 4-seat certified aircraft, instrument flying, full useful load missions, serious cross-country speed, aren't going anywhere. Their missions require what the traditional market provides, and no amount of regulatory change in the sport pilot space changes that math. But here's the complication that the traditional market doesn't like to sit with. The recreational and lifestyle buyers who are going to be pulled away by Mosaic. How big is that population as a share of total traditional GA demand? Bigger than the marketing would suggest. Much bigger. The honest data on how private pilots actually use their airplanes, which we've already touched on, suggests that a very large fraction of private aircraft ownership is lifestyle and recreational in nature, rather than mission-critical. And that fraction of the market is exactly the most exposed to the sport pilot alternative that Mosaic opens up. There's a pricing implication here that is going to take years to fully play out, but it's worth starting to think through now. If a meaningful segment of the buyer pool for new four-seat certified aircraft migrates toward the sport pilot world as Mosaic matures and the aircraft options in that world expand and improve, the traditional market is left with a more concentrated buyer pool of genuinely mission-critical users. Those buyers are real, they're serious, and they have real purchasing power, but there are fewer of them as a share of the total aviation-interested population than the current market is sized to serve. What happens to new aircraft production volumes, to manufacturer revenue, and ultimately to pricing when the addressable buyer pool shrinks even modestly? The short answer is nothing good in the near term for either manufacturers or buyers who remain in the traditional market, because a smaller addressable market for expensive, low-volume products makes those products even more expensive to produce on a per-unit basis, which pushes prices higher, which further shrinks the addressable buyer pool, which is exactly the kind of feedback loop that nobody in the traditional market wants to talk about openly, but that the economics point toward. Let's talk about the aircraft manufacturers who are positioned to benefit most from this shift and what they're doing that the traditional manufacturers are watching nervously. The sport pilot and light sport aircraft space has attracted some genuinely sophisticated manufacturing operations over the last decade, particularly from European and Australian producers who have deep experience building light aircraft for markets where aviation has always been more cost-constrained than in the United States. Companies like Pipistrel, Flight Design, Tecnam, Shaw, and others have built aircraft in this space that are, by any fair measure, modern and capable and well-engineered. The avionics integration is current. The airframe materials and safety structures meet or exceed what buyers expect from this price point. The engines are reliable and fuel efficient. These are not compromise airplanes in the way that a lot of traditional GA pilots might instinctively assume when they hear light sport. They are purpose-built, well-thought-out aircraft that are genuinely excellent at what they do. As Mosaic expands the allowed performance envelope and weight ceiling, these manufacturers have the opportunity to extend their designs upward into the space that the new rules open up, offering buyers aircraft that weren't previously available in the U.S. market under sport pilot rules, but that now fit cleanly within the expanded category. That's a product development opportunity that the traditional certified manufacturers, with their longer certification timelines and more expensive type certification process, cannot respond to quickly. A light sport manufacturer who can bring a new, expanded capability aircraft to market through the simpler light sport aircraft consensus standard certification path has a regulatory speed advantage over a Part 23 manufacturer trying to get a new design certified. And that speed advantage matters enormously when the regulatory window has just opened and buyers are figuring out what the new landscape looks like. There's also a genuine innovation story here that's playing out in favor of the sport pilot space. Electric and hybrid propulsion, advanced composite structures, modern glass avionics suites as standard rather than expensive options, these technologies have found it much easier to enter the market through the light sport aircraft pathway than through the traditional Part 23 certification process, because the consensus standards that govern light sport aircraft certification are, by design, more adaptable and easier to update than the full FAA-type certification process. The airplanes coming out of the light sports segment in the next several years, as Mosaic matures, are going to be at the leading edge of aviation technology in ways that the traditional certified market may struggle to match at the same price point. Not because traditional manufacturers lack the engineering capability, but because the regulatory path for getting new technology into a certified aircraft is genuinely harder and more expensive than the light sport equivalent. Think about what that means for a buyer who's deciding between a new four-seat traditional certified airplane and an expanding capability sport pilot aircraft. They're not just comparing useful load and cruise speed anymore. They're comparing an aircraft that represents technology from a design lineage that is, in many cases, decades old, updated with modern avionics but fundamentally a 1960s or 1970s airframe that has been refined and recertified against a purpose-built modern design that incorporates current composite technology, current avionics thinking, and in some cases current propulsion thinking. For a buyer who cares about being in an airplane that represents where aviation is going rather than where it's been, that comparison increasingly favors the modern sport pilot aircraft in ways that the traditional market doesn't have a simple answer to. Let's bring this back to concrete terms and talk about what this means for specific buying scenarios that real people are actually navigating right now. Take a buyer in their early 40s, professionally successful, has the financial wherewithal for a real aviation investment, got interested in flying during the pandemic, did some discovery flights, genuinely wants to become a pilot and own an airplane. Under the old rules, that buyer's path was essentially predetermined. Private certificate, third-class medical, and eventually a traditional 4-seat certified airplane as the natural endpoint of the system. Under Mosaic, that buyer has a real decision to make. If their intended flying is primarily weekend recreation, short cross-country trips within a few hundred miles, flying alone or with one passenger, without any near-term ambition toward instrument flying, and that describes a very large share of new entrants' actual flying patterns, the sport pilot path gets them to their actual goal for dramatically less money, without the medical uncertainty, and in a more modern aircraft than the traditional path might deliver at an equivalent investment level. For that buyer, the sport pilot conversation is genuinely compelling, and the traditional market's response to that buyer is essentially, well, if you ever want to get serious about aviation, you'll need a real airplane. That framing, the implicit dismissal of sport flying as not serious flying, is exactly the cultural posture that has cost general aviation new entrants for decades, and it is not going to serve the traditional market well as the sport pilot world expands in capability and credibility under Mosaic. Or take the retired professional, mid-60s, financially comfortable, got a private certificate years ago, wants to come back to flying after a 15-year break. They're looking at managing a medical that has more history attached to it than it did when they were 35. They're looking at a traditional 4-seat aircraft market that charges $500,000 or more for what they need. They're looking at annual costs for hangaring, insuring, and maintaining a certified aircraft that might run $30,000 a year. And they're now looking at a sport pilot world where, with a driver's license, a manageable refresher, and an investment well below 6 figures, they can get back in the air and fly the kind of missions they actually want to fly in retirement. For a genuinely large number of people in exactly that position, Mosaic is not a niche consideration. It's the answer to a question they'd already half decided they couldn't afford to ask. Now think about what happens at the flight school level, because the training ecosystem is where buyer pipelines actually start, and flight schools are the first place that Mosaic's implications hit the real market. Flight schools today are generally organized around the traditional training pathway, primary training in a basic 2-seat or 4-seat single, building toward private certificate, instrument, and beyond. The Sport Pilot Certificate has been a smaller sidebar in most flight school curricula, offered as an option for specific students but not the main event. As Mosaic expands what Sport Pilot can do and who it makes sense for, forward-looking flight schools are already starting to think about how to offer Sport Pilot training as a genuine first-choice path rather than a lesser alternative. What does that mean in practice? It means a flight school student might come in for an initial consultation and for the first time, hear a genuinely serious pitch about Sport Pilot as an equal option rather than the private certificate. It means training aircraft lineups might shift. A school that previously bought all 4-seat trainers might start mixing in 2-seat modern sport aircraft that cost significantly less to purchase and operate, improving their margins while giving them a training fleet better matched to the Sport Pilot curriculum. It means training timelines and cost structures for Sport Pilot, which have always been more accessible than the private certificate, get more attention from students who are cost-conscious and don't need the full capability of a private certificate to reach their actual goals. Every student who goes through a Sport Pilot training pathway, instead of a private certificate pathway, is, downstream, a potential buyer of Sport Pilot aircraft, rather than traditional 4-seat certified aircraft. The conversion from training category to ownership category is not one-for-one. Some sport pilots will eventually upgrade, some won't buy any airplane. But the structural shift in training pipeline composition is real, and it works against traditional 4-seat demand in a quiet, sustained way that is harder to see in any given quarter but very visible over a decade. There's a generational dimension to this that's worth pulling out explicitly. The new entrant to aviation today is looking at this through a completely different lens than someone who came into aviation 20 or 30 years ago. Today's new entrant has grown up in an environment where the default assumption in almost every other consumer market is that you don't have to buy more than you need, where subscription and fractional and shared access models have replaced outright ownership in category after category, and where the financial case for a large, illiquid, expensive-to-maintain discretionary purchase has gotten much harder to make against the backdrop of other investment options, housing costs, and general economic complexity. That buyer doesn't romanticize aircraft ownership the way previous generations did, not universally anyway. They're more likely to run the math cold and ask whether the traditional path delivers value proportionate to its cost. And in many cases, especially for purely recreational flying, the honest answer is that it doesn't. The sport pilot world, as Mosaic expands it, offers that generation an entry point that matches their actual needs at a price point that survives the cold financial analysis. And once you've entered aviation through the sport pilot door and found that it meets your actual flying goals, the traditional four-seat market has a real argument to make for why you should step up. But it has to be a good argument, one that's grounded in genuine additional capability you actually need, not just tradition and inertia, and that's just how real pilots do it. The manufacturers who are going to be most challenged by this shift are the ones building in the middle of the traditional market. Not the very high end, where buyers have mission-critical capability requirements that Sport Pilot can't touch, but the mid-range, the basic four-seat piston single market that has historically served the lifestyle and recreational buyer. That airplane, priced at $400,000 to $500,000 new, against a well-equipped modern Sport Pilot aircraft in the $150,000 to $250,000 range, is going to face genuinely difficult conversations with a buyer who does an honest assessment of what they need versus what they're being asked to pay for. The Cessna 172 is the starkest example of this, and I want to spend a moment on it because it's such an emblematic case. The 172 is the best-selling airplane in history, the aircraft that more pilots have trained in than any other, the symbol of accessible general aviation. But today's 172 is $500,000 worth of airplane in a lot of configurations, and that price, combined with the ongoing ownership costs, against a modern sport pilot aircraft that can accomplish many of the same recreational and local flying missions at a fraction of the cost, is a real competitive challenge. Cessna and its parent company Textron are not blind to this. They're large, sophisticated businesses with significant resources and market intelligence. But the structural constraint they face is that their certification infrastructure, their production line, their liability exposure, and their cost structure are all built around the full FAA-type certification world, and pivoting meaningfully into the sport pilot space is not something they can do quickly or easily without essentially building a parallel manufacturing identity alongside their existing operation. What happens in the market as Mosaic matures and more sophisticated, capable aircraft enter the sport pilot category is a genuine bifurcation. The traditional certified four-seat market increasingly concentrates on the buyers who genuinely need everything it offers: instrument capability, full useful load, high cruise speeds, serious cross-country transportation utility. Those buyers are real, and they have resources, but they're a smaller buyer pool than the current market is sized to serve, and the production volumes and pricing structures that make sense for that pool are different from what makes sense for a broader market. The sport pilot world, expanded by Mosaic, serves the recreational and lifestyle buyers who are always the volume base of general aviation participation, at price points that are genuinely more accessible, in aircraft that are genuinely more modern in many ways. Both worlds survive, but the traditional world shrinks to its genuinely differentiated niche, and the volume that currently supports its economics goes somewhere else. The dealers who sell traditional four-seat certified aircraft are already starting to feel this, even if they're not attributing it to sport pilot reform directly yet. The buyer conversations have gotten harder, the questions about price have gotten more pointed. The willingness to pay a premium for traditional certified status versus asking, why can't I do this same trip in a modern light sport aircraft for $200,000 less, has gotten more common. Some of it is general price sensitivity and financing cost. Some of it is the insurance environment. Some of it is Mosaic specifically, as buyers who've researched their options realize the landscape has genuinely changed. and some of it is just the cumulative effect of years of price increases finally hitting a wall where the traditional value proposition doesn't hold up to careful scrutiny anymore. For the dealer talking to that buyer, the honest conversation requires acknowledging what the sport pilot world now offers and making a real case for why the traditional path delivers enough additional value to justify the premium. Not every dealer is equipped to have that conversation yet, because for most of the last 2 decades, it was a conversation you simply didn't have to have. The sport pilot buyer was a different customer, going elsewhere, not a competitive alternative for the same buyer you were trying to close on a new 4-seat single. That mental separation is over, and the dealers who figure that out earliest are going to be in a meaningfully better position than the ones still treating sport pilot reform as something that only affects the light aircraft enthusiast community in the back corner of the air show. From a manufacturing industry perspective, the most important strategic question Mosaic raises is not how does this affect our sales this quarter, but what does our addressable market actually look like in 5 to 10 years? And are we building the right products for that market at the right price points? The honest answer to that question requires confronting some uncomfortable realities about where the recreational and lifestyle buyer is going, and it's going increasingly toward the sport pilot world, drawn by lower barriers to entry, dramatically lower cost, genuine modernity in the aircraft being produced for that market, and the removal of the medical hurdle that has quietly kept millions of motivated potential pilots out of the traditional GA ecosystem. The manufacturers who move aggressively into the Mosaic expanded space, whether by building dedicated light sport aircraft to the new standards, by partnering with existing light sport manufacturers to offer a broader product range, or by figuring out how to certify existing designs to the new light sport consensus standards, are positioning to capture the volume growth that Mosaic represents. The manufacturers who stay purely in the traditional certified space because